the lens that I have now coming into the mining space, which is it's all a startup, but instead of a single business being a startup, this whole industry is a startup.
Hello, I am Cody Allingham, and this is the Transformation of Value podcast. In this episode, I talk with Robert Warren, author of the Bitcoin Miner's Almanac, Where Code Meets Business and Everything in Between, published 2024. We discuss the book, which gives an excellent overview of what Bitcoin mining is and the operational considerations, as well as fascinating case studies of the different business models and types of mining operations. Alongside this, we discuss energy and the electrical grid more broadly, as well as how to communicate Bitcoin mining and the importance of maintaining the grid and producing energy for human flourishing. If you would like to support my work and growing this show, please consider tipping some Bitcoin to the show's wallet. Otherwise, pass this episode on to a friend who you think may enjoy it. If you have any questions or feedback, please reach out. My emails are always open, hello@thetransformationofvalue.com. Otherwise, on to the show. Robert, I thought maybe we could start a little bit just about your background and by way of introduction, sort of where you're from and I guess how you came to be working in Bitcoin mining, if that's okay, please.
Oh, sure. Yeah, well, the thing about Bitcoin is it's very much a get in where you fit in kind of space. Anyone that has made the jump from not working in Bitcoin to working in Bitcoin, I think has very much experienced that. Myself, I'm no different. I grew up kind of north suburbs of Chicago, Illinois, that area, and spent the majority of my 20s in New Orleans, actually, which is almost due south at the mouth of the Mississippi River, and was working in startup down there. Didn't really get into working into Bitcoin full time when I was in New Orleans, but was introduced to Bitcoin at that time. I was running a startup, so it was one of those things that I thought was just interesting, and I thought that it would make me just gloriously rich in 2016, 2017, and didn't really understand the technology deeply, hadn't studied the white paper deeply, and wound up relocating a couple of years later to the Denver area where I am now. That's where my wife grew up, so that's where we are, and that coincided with the 2018, 2019, 2019, 2020, and then 2020 was, of course, COVID. And that was when I kind of rediscovered Bitcoin as a living, breathing thing, and not just this kind of esoteric technological thing that some very smart cryptographers were working on, and I probably would never contribute to, but I could kind of be a flag bearer for it. And coinciding with that discovery that Bitcoin really was a living, breathing thing. It was the network, it was the nodes, it was the signing devices, and it was all of these things that you did. You could do Bitcoin, and Bitcoin was always doing, it was always hashing, it was always running, it was always, hunting for the next block. That is what piqued my interest as far as Bitcoin mining was concerned. And from there, as they say, the rest is history. You wind up on Twitter, you see all the brilliant people there that are building interesting things. Started getting involved in mining from some other folks that I had met at some early conferences I went to, BitBlock Boom in particular, down in Texas. And from there, had a couple of S9s shipped to the house. Actually, not a house, it was an apartment up on the fifth floor on North Wash Park in Denver, and plugged them into our second bathroom outlet, and immediately had to figure out, oh my goodness, I'm running a piece of industrial equipment in this apartment building, this like 1970s apartment building in Denver. This isn't going to work, right? Started getting involved in some of the sound stuff that was going on. Early black box that Steve Barber was building was a brown box. It was essentially a container that you could build out of a single 4x8 sheet of plywood. So I wound up building one and throwing it on our balcony so that I could throw these ASICs outside instead of turning our second bathroom into a sauna. And from there, jumped into working in the space, and from working in the space, was both, really impassioned and excited by it, but also really frustrated because nobody was kind of coming out and making sense of what tied all of Bitcoin mining together. You were always hearing like, oh, the home miners or the heating miners are going to save the world, or the guys that are doing oil and gas are going to save the world, or it's not even worth it to mine because the mega miners are just going to scoop it all up. and it didn't really make sense to me. And that was what brought me really the impetus for the book was this frustration and seeing all these cool business models, and everybody seemed, they're smart people in the space. They knew their business models worked, but the talk that you would hear online or the talk that you would hear in the news media didn't reflect what was unique or different about these models. Uh, and there was no kind of unifying set of principles. So really what I set out to do was see if I could uncover those, if I could write those down and do that in a way that would help educate other people to make sense of the space.
Yeah, that's really awesome. And I guess coming back to, you mentioned some work you're doing in startups prior to your work in Bitcoin. How would you contrast that with what you're doing now? I mean, do you feel like there's a difference in how you approach it and what it means to you personally? Were those skills able to transfer over? How would you sort of compare the before and after?
A good question. It's same but different, right? When I you kind of look back into your 20s, and it's like everybody who started something knows this, that when you started, you're so gung ho and you're ready to like sleep in the office and grind and earn your dollars. And you do that and it's great. And you put an immense amount of work into it and you take so much pride into building this thing. But you just spend so much time learning really simple stuff. And it's because you're just beating your head against this thing called a business. And not only is it just a business, it's not like you're a plumber or you're an HVAC specialist where there's, hundreds of these people. You're trying to do something new or unique. So not only are you trying to figure out how to be a competent business owner, you're also trying to figure out how the heck do I sell something new? How do I introduce like a consumer to a new product? And that's why so many startups fail, rightfully so. It's not because the people are dumb. It's just because you're trying to do something exceptionally hard. And at the age that you're often doing it, you don't know any better than to say, yeah, let's just go gung ho and do it. And, one of the best lessons there, I think, was to not spend too long on something. So I think people you really kind of fall in love with what you're doing. I had a number of companies I started in New Orleans, but the one that really kind of picked up was a company called Gigsy that was it was essentially like a high volume multimedia production company. So I'd been shooting photography professionally for a number of years at the time, probably 15 years at this point. And what I got really frustrated is I just hated kind of the repetition of it, right? And the only way to excel as a photographer was to like, grow your hair out, which I could do that, but to be even more like esoteric and to just, to walk around and to be fancy and to really draw people into your vision. And then you could charge the big bucks for photography. And I didn't really see that, right? Like I love the technicality and I love the events and the human side of photography, but I wasn't into like, selling the sizzle, the grand vision. Like I just wanted to take amazing photographs and I was doing a ton of commercial work. So what we built was essentially a commercial product where companies could come to us and just buy a block of almost outsourced photo video. So they would come to us and they would sign, $12,000, $24,000 contract, and they would have a full calendar of events that they wanted photos for. They would want staff headshots. They would want a couple of videos coming out every year, commercial stuff to give to their marketing team. So we became this outsourced production team for them, and it was wonderful. But thank God we grew that company, and a silly mistake that I made, which was giving away too much of the company to a partner early on, was what came and killed the company later. Because when you're not going in the same direction and you've handed away too much of the company, it's very hard to steer the ship in one direction or the other. There's a reason. There's a reason boats don't have two captains, right?
Hmm.
So essentially, and thank God, that organization was a great success. But coming into the Bitcoin space, it really makes you a lot more conscientious about, okay, I kind of did my MBA and getting my butt kicked by the real world by starting this company and growing it and making all these mistakes and really kind of wearing my heart on my sleeve. I can still be super passionate about what I'm doing. And in some sense, I am even more now because this Bitcoin thing is really existential to me. It's not something that I'm comfortable kind of getting up on a pulpit and like I'm not going to be the dude, preaching at Thanksgiving, driving everybody crazy, saying like, "Oh, you've got to get on the Bitcoin." Like I'm just not that guy. Uh, but I'm incredibly passionate about what we're doing in the Bitcoin space and
Yeah.
why we're doing what we're doing in the Bitcoin space.
Yeah.
And the lens that I have now coming into the mining space, which is it's all a startup, but instead of a single business being a startup, this whole industry is a startup. We've got the book went to print, and in the book that says there's three ways to cool machines. Literally the week after it went to print, that was wrong because Mara announced two-phase cooling.
Mm.
And so now I'm rewriting, and it's wonderful. It's absolutely brilliant technology that they have, and the cooling factors are brilliant. The use case is brilliant, but it's an example of the fact that this whole industry is a startup. The whole industry. It's nothing like, oh, you're just going to start this company on your own. No, literally every single one of your vendors is essentially a startup. Some of the oldest people in the game are some of the ASIC producers, or frankly, some of the guys who are like, doing the plumbing on your immersion setups. Like those are the dudes with 40 years of experience. Nobody else has more than 10.
Yeah, I just want to pull on that photography piece a little bit, Robert, because my background is photography as well, actually.
No kidding.
Yeah, so I've done a lot of architectural photography and interior work, and
Cool.
something I just, I think you will relate to this, but something I always found before I was into Bitcoin, it was always this hustle and this grind, and I had a certain sort of photography I was doing. It sounds like you were doing more like events and that sort of thing. Is that?
But by the end, it was a huge mix, but it
Yeah,
was it was super, super events driven.
yeah. I mean, I
Because New
was.
Orleans is an event city, right?
Yeah, well, we got Mardi Gras and all of that.
That's
But
right.
with what I was doing, it was buildings and working with architects and these kinds of things. But what I was really passionate about was telling the story of places, and that
Mm,
was kind of a hard sell. And so I was up against this thing where I was like, well, I could just go and take the shot. Or I could try and work on something a bit more meaningful, and I was
that's right.
always more in kind of the artistic side, and it wasn't until I discovered Bitcoin that I began to learn about time preference and all of these things, and you realize it is a bit of a rat race, and especially with image making, because there's always someone ready to fill your shoes and take your spot, and so it's sort of
That's right.
it certainly has changed my perspective on creativity, which is interesting to hear, and I've got the long hair as well, so
See, that's how you know you're a good photographer.
yeah, got long hair. But look, diving into the Bitcoin Miners Almanac, as I said, I really enjoyed it, reading it. I love the analogy that we're calling them shoeboxes now. I think I'm going to go and run with that. So,
Love that.
all Bitcoin ASICs are basically shoeboxes with four parts: the power source, control board, hash board, and a cooling mechanism. And when you start thinking about the inputs and the outputs, you can start mapping it on to other industrial processes or other kind of places and just sort of seeing how it fits. It's this kind of like, it's like a jigsaw puzzle. You can kind of find where those things can fit and apply it and see if there's some arbitrage that can be profitable as a business. But as you say, the Bitcoin mining industry is also distinctively different from the Bitcoin software industry because, I mean, we're having to pay for power and make money. And so, I mean, looking at that aspect of it, the kind of the business side of Bitcoin mining, how do you think overall it has evolved just in the time that you've been involved in Bitcoin mining?
Oh my goodness, huge. I mean, I heard stories of guys that were running in 27, 2018
The old
in
days.
which is the old, yeah, it's a joke that would be the old days. Running in a huge warehouse that I think had like maybe 5 to 10 megawatts at the wall, which is huge by 2017, 2018 standards. But that's barely table stakes for large mining nowadays. I heard stories from guys who were setting up facilities like that were so tied in, so exuberant about plugging in machines that they didn't know what their rate for electricity was. And they didn't know this concept of hash price, which is the value of the work that the machine does. They literally just thought, I have a machine that makes money. Let me just plug these machines in. And they were very surprised when $1 million electrical bill had accrued. And the owner of the building that received the bill was actually very surprised as well. We're only 3 years out from that. And or 3 years, geez, we're 7 years out from that. But it was only 3 years out from that you started to get into large scale deployments of like S19s, the M30s. This was before the 21s. This was before the XPs. What's wild is that now those 30s are basically becoming obsolete. The S19s are slowly moving towards obsolescence. Now it's M50s and M60s. Now it's M53s and 63s, immersion and hydro machines. Now it's S21s. Everything has changed so drastically in the last 7 years,
Hmm.
so drastically. And even though the companies are big in some cases, it does not reflect that they have reached a point of what you might call business stability. It is all speculative. It is speculative on an immense level. When you start looking at maybe medium or smaller scale operations or home mining, those are even less defined. That I think if you were to think in terms of the size of a facility, you could say that maybe the largest facilities have the most overqualified people kind of gnawing on what these business models look like and what they mean. And they also have the largest access to capital. They have the public markets. And as a result of that, they get to basically speculate very publicly about where the business model is going to be. But they do not have an end state business model. They're dumping hundreds of millions of dollars into build outs or acquisitions that are still extremely speculative. If you go down a notch to folks that are, maybe setting up their own 10, 20 megawatt facilities, they're self-funding, things like this, they are very much playing a very competitive mom and pop game, and in some sense are more sort of dialed into their strategy because they're operating at a small scale. But by no means does that mean that they have reached kind of an end state. We've started to uncover what the core metrics are. The efficiency of the machines, that's one that you can control. Your electric rate, that's another one that hopefully you'd be able to control. And we started to figure out the ones that we don't control. Hash price. And within that, we even have ways to hedge around those particular factors. So the biggest one with hash price, Luxor has a series of derivatives. This is less than like a year old. And this would be considered, old hat in any large commodity industry to be able to hedge the production of your product. You look at Chicago in particular and the commodities exchanges and the creation of forwards and futures products. There's 100-something-year-old financial products that essentially allow farmers to hedge the cost of their production or hedge against their production. We're only getting that now in the last year in Bitcoin mining, and the people that are doing it are very, very new at doing it. So I personally think that we're nowhere near a terminal state or end state of what the optimal Bitcoin business will look like. Uh, that's made even more sort of impassioned by the fact that as the machines start to change, it starts to actually change what your setup looks like. So as new machines come out, the biggest difference in a lot of these new machines is that really twofold, right? They draw substantially more power. So you have a power density shift in the way that your facility is set up. And they also often draw three-phase as opposed to single-phase electricity, which is an infrastructure change. It
Hmm.
means that architecturally you have to change the way that your building receives that electrical power and breaks it down. You're not sort of just plugging out one machine and putting another one in there. These are huge build outs that will radically change what people are having to do in the way that they deploy capital. So we're nowhere near the end of what I would think would be considered like a terminal or optimized business case, right? And I think we probably have another 5 to 10 years before we can start to figure out what that looks like.
Yeah, it's a very interesting, just how much it's changing. And then also, there's kind of different strata which you sort of identify in your case studies where there's still a lot of people using the older gear, and it sort of means you've got these different kind of cohorts where at one end you've got the most efficient publicly traded miners, maybe purely focused on the cost of energy being low and the efficiency of the
Yeah.
machines being high. But as an example, I've just released an episode recently with a team who are mining Bitcoin here in Japan, and that's using stranded solar. And they basically just need anything that can suck up the load, and so they're able to use S9s. And it actually is a really good story for reusing and recycling older machines. But whatever they need to get that 50 kilowatt of load, doesn't really matter. The Bitcoin they get out the other end is a nice bonus, but that sort of speaks to maybe the sort of the ecosystem as a whole. There's sort of a place for everybody. And on the other end of that, you've got high-end facilities that are trying to optimize with three-phase and the most efficient machines. So there's kind of a quite a broad range of ways you can approach it, which I think is very interesting.
That's right. What's interesting to me too, when you look at it from that perspective. So if you forget about the Bitcoin thing, you think about a shoebox and you think about this like shoebox that, depending on what model of shoebox, you can monetize electricity. Once you think about it in those terms, exactly like you say, it's just a device that you can plug into places. It's a waste-seeking device. It has nothing, you could care less about the hashing, about the hash boards. If the only thing that you cared about was where's my waste and what would the shoebox have to look like to marginally profit me to get rid of that waste? If that's the only thing that you care about, right? You can find so many business models where all of a sudden it becomes very, very feasible to just stack S9s, exactly as you're saying, and just run them into the dirt because you need to get rid of that waste. And that's what makes sense marginally. You don't care if it's the S9, the 19, the 21, the XP. You could care less. You have a different problem. And I think that's really interesting when you start to look at inefficiency in the world around us, particularly in our energy sector.
Yeah. Well, something I wanted to ask you about. So, actually, just last night I went to an event, and it was quite interesting. There was some VC people there, some different kinds of people, and I sort of it was actually quite funny. I don't know if you have you been to Japan before, Robert?
Never. I would love to, though.
Yeah, it was kind of weird because it was like riding the subway, and everyone's wearing like grey suits. It was after work, and I was walking around with this like orange like thing, and it was very bright and flamboyant.
Oh, I
and
love
it's
that.
just it was just kind of I had to take a moment for self inspection. What am I doing? But I started talking to these guys, and I explained, I've just released this episode on Bitcoin mining in Japan and how it's helping with grid stability and all of these grand ideas. But there was quite a lot of negativity, I must say, and these were ought to be educated people, and they should understand that there's some real challenges with the grid, and Bitcoin mining can help. But I was keen to hear your thoughts on, I guess, the storytelling around the grid relationship, because this is quite complex. We can talk about these shoe boxes, but people still say, well, you might as well use batteries or pump the hydro, which we know isn't always the correct solution. That doesn't always fit.
Sure.
So it's sort of like the storytelling of like the use of energy, especially when someone maybe doesn't understand the proposition of Bitcoin itself. How have you found that from your end?
What's funny is it's funny that you mentioned these VC guys and how it makes sense why they would be turned off by this thing, because essentially the proposition you're giving to them isn't the sexy VC story. Because the sexy VC story is we make a new thing and it is a smash hit success, and we can barely produce it as quickly as people are trying to consume it, or we can barely stand up the rack space because our servers are overheating because people love it so much, and then we sell to Microsoft for $20 billion, or some private equity company acquires us and we change the world. We're the 100x or the 1000x or the Uber or whatever it might be, right? And it's funny because I was just having this conversation with my wife actually about one of her cousins works in software, and he posted something that she commented on where he was kind of like dunking on Bitcoin. Oh, it's the old technology, like, oh, it's like the what you hear people say, it's the boomer coin. It's like it's not technologically interesting, right? And you ask yourself, like, why do these VCs and these very smart tech guys hate on this thing? And I think it kind of harkens maybe to a value that is maybe not antithetical to those domains, but it is one that is easily overlooked in the world of speed, which is that, and it's something that our grandparents knew, which is that it's cheaper to take care of something than it is to replace it. And oftentimes you're not going through these kind of phase changes in terms of how the world around you is changing, right? Like to get a bunch of people onto cell phones, like take Africa, for example, like one of my buddies who lived and worked there made the point to me that, everybody's walking around with a cell phone, but they might not have cable internet to their house. And it's because they basically jumped over this whole electrification age, or this whole like pulling wires age that we went through in the US and other developed countries, and went straight to the wireless age. And so you have people that are living in unelectrified houses that still have smartphones that just go, charge them at the public tap, or go pay a guy to leave it at his store. And that's sexy, right? Like it's technology, it's new. But with something like the grid, you're not going to get that. It's a really big investment. It's sort of like a castle, right? If you're going to buy a castle, you're going to have to do a lot of retrofits and renovations. The question is, do you want to tear down the castle or do you want to keep it in perpetuity because it's a family heirloom or something that you care about? Now, in the case of the grid, it's something that has utility. It's something that provides a service to us. And the US as a country, we're not necessarily in this kind of crack up boom, explosive, demographically growing place. Japan isn't either. Demographically, we're just not blowing up and growing. So we don't really have that kind of tailwind of development and building and infrastructure and growth and things like that. And it's very unsexy to say, hey, we have this existing thing, this kind of creaky old castle, the grid. And the best thing that we could actually do with it is squeeze every ounce of efficiency out of it and to make it better in that way and to do it in kind of a slow and methodical and caring way. Get the historian to come and look at all of the wallpaper and the patchworks in your castle and to really do it properly, to kind of fix it up nicely, to make it a period piece. That's not sexy. It's sexy to have your spaceship to Mars.
Mm.
It's a totally different game if you're saying, I want to preserve something and I want to take care of something and I want to monetize it in a new way. But that's what we're doing with Bitcoin. And that's why, particularly in mining, I think that's where you see it most obviously, because in mining, you have to tap into all of these other aspects of the world. You have to tap into plumbing, you have to tap into electricians, you have to tap into a lot of traditional business. And it's not necessarily kind of sexy new stuff. The innovations have kind of been had, and we're kind of tracking towards efficiency and tracking towards better cooling, but it's not like we're getting an Uber of Bitcoin mining at this point. Not to say we couldn't, but we're living on the grid and we're making it incrementally better. And that I think is something really valuable that our grandparents knew. That's something that I think a lot of Bitcoiners think about because we think in terms, you mentioned time preference, low time preference, legacy, doing things that will last 100 years. That is very different from the move fast and break stuff or fail fast ideology of the VC or the startup space.
Yeah. Well, I find it interesting. I'm originally from New Zealand, and there's a whole lot of startups emerging out of New Zealand, and I think globally as well, around smart meters for the home, being able to turn off your electric vehicle and charge it at certain times of the day and have this kind of network, this fleet of these kind of batteries that are within vehicles that are charging at different times, etc. And there seems to be a lot of froth around that. And some of it's very interesting, but I always come back to this feeling that people will look at everything else except Bitcoin for some reason, and they don't appreciate the value proposition. And so, some kind of insane idea about pumping water to the top of a hill, even though maybe you don't have any hills around you. Or
that's right. They want to do the sexy thing.
Yeah, the sexy thing. And I think I just struggle a little bit to understand where things go, because at the end of the day, these are the guys who are allocating the capital and they're looking for that sexy thing. And I've had people literally say to me, we need this, we need it to make money as quickly as possible. And so it's like, again, this kind of hangover from the zero interest rate period, which we've had for many years. And it seems as if, as you say, the grid, it's this kind of heirloom that we've inherited. And in the case of New Zealand and, I imagine the US as well, a lot of the generation assets are from the olden days. And it's hard to think that we could build more nuclear power stations or more hydro schemes or any of that stuff like we did back in the old days, just given the regulatory environment today. So it's like, maybe solar farms can be built out, but then there's all these other challenges. So it seems as if we're sort of sleepwalking into this energy deficit, which these guys I was talking to last night didn't seem to think so. But I, sort of deep down, I'm seeing the energy prices go up in my own country. And I think, man, I don't know what the long-term outcome is if we keep going down that path. So a little bit concerning potentially.
I think that's a super reasonable concern. And it's exactly because it's not sexy and it's been at the confluence of some very interesting historical trends. And you were able to have essentially US speaking, but it's been a global phenomenon. You were able to have this kind of combination of environmental malice or apathy about nuclear combined with ire about coal and a lot of the insistence, particularly in the US, not in China by any means. China is standing up an insane amount of coal plants. Most of US Most of the U.S. coal was actually not consumed in the U.S. It's shipped overseas. Most of that decrease in production that we have seen through particularly like the environmental lens that has been kind of historically in the US, most of the decrease has been covered up through natural gas production in the US.
Mm-hmm.
And because we've been able to stand up an immense amount of these very efficient, very responsive, intermediate following load combined cycle natural gas plants, and natural gas has just been absolutely dirt cheap. And thank God it is a product. It's a secondary product to the oil and gas industry where you basically have the more valuable thing underneath, and you have to deal with both of these products. So you have kind of a combined supply chain on that front. We have kind of been sleepwalking in that sense, though, where we haven't had that sort of catalyst moment where we've gone, oh crap, we should really be building nuclear if we want to have what we say. That's sort of my personal bias, not sort of my objective or unbiased perspective. My personal bias is like we were basically taking the bait of a lot of this environmental lobbying and didn't have a counterpoint because the whole problem was basically covered up through natural gas generation. And there's going to be this moment when the cows come home and all of a sudden we go, oh crap, we are going to be in an energy deficit. And hopefully we're not looking at a situation where the technology on the nuclear front is taking too long to stand up. Now, I know the speeds have improved dramatically. The safety, of course, has improved dramatically. I think the best thing, though, to kick that off, if there's a catalyzing moment, is the demand for energy. And the wonderful thing that we have right now is we have two very different consumers demanding immense amounts of energy in the US, which is that we have this AI, HPC, GPU load, which is a very, very intensive, very specific kind of data center build out and is very, very keen to stay up all the time. And then you have the Bitcoin miners who are the buyer of first resort and the buyer of last resort, who are playing on the margins and are very, very willing to negotiate with you. And I think that we talk about them in competition with each other. I think what's more interesting to me is how they catalyze a macro response in terms of energy grids, because they essentially can provide an immense amount of demand. Should, the AI HPC thing play out? We kind of know the Bitcoin thing is playing out. We know that we really like to build huge mining sites in the right kind of places and we want to negotiate them. The AI HPC thing is a little bit newer, but the winds seem to be blowing in that direction. For all intents and purposes, if we're restarting 3 Mile Island to start to use that energy for AI HPC, that's a pretty strong indication that this thing is probably not going to go away, especially when you have these very large legacy companies that are investing in this.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned nuclear. The gentleman who showed me around this Bitcoin mining facility and that we went and visited it, actually, he's originally a nuclear engineer, and really, really fascinating, in the sort of the heyday. So that was with TEPCO in Japan, but they actually were working on some really incredible stuff. And unfortunately, with the disaster they had and the accident they had in 2011, that sort of put a little bit of a global chilling effect on the development of nuclear. And I think, and even my own country, New Zealand, has ostensibly a nuclear-free policy, which originally was focused on American warships coming through, but it's sort of led into nuclear energy. It's sort of there's this narrative problem, and I actually see real similarities between the sort of narrative marketing challenge of Bitcoin and nuclear, because I think the innovations of sort of small nuclear reactors and some of the stuff that's coming out now is extremely exciting, and it could basically solve all our problems. But people are very reluctant. There's like a cultural memory of 3 Mile, Chernobyl, Fukushima. And that was
good marketing. We made too many HBO specials about the disasters and not enough about the successes.
Yeah. And it's sort of like I don't know, and this is a big question, but I think within the Bitcoin space, there could be a lot of alignment with that base load you get from nuclear, and globally seeing more of this roll out would be really interesting. So I don't know who's looking at that from the energy side. The conversation around nuclear, because, I think right now wind and solar are the hype, and I mean, we know there's challenges with those
Well,
with variable load, right? So
yeah, you bring up a really interesting point on that front because when we think about the grid is actually a lot of different things, right? You have tens or hundreds of generators, and all of those generators are producing energy in very different ways. They also sit in very different they sit differently in the priority stack in terms of how they are dispatched by the grid operator. Now, the grid operator isn't necessarily affiliated with a single generator. They're concerned with the health and safety of the grid and maintaining the frequency of the grid, but they have to kind of sort all these odd bedfellows, whether it's your wind or your solar or your thermal loads, or if it's your hydroelectric, and they're all producing in very different ways. And when you break it down and you think about how Bitcoin serves the grid, you can think about it in the macro way, like you mentioned, the grid, which is the problem of the grid operator trying to balance load, which they very much do in the case of a company like Riot or Texas operators who can be called on to curtail and basically serve as the inverse of a peaker plant, give back hundreds of megawatts so that the demand of the consumer is not stopped. You don't have to ask your consumer to stop consuming. You simply ask another consumer or somebody who is lower on the priority stack to stop consuming, and that's a really important hedge for the operator. But then if you go further back into the actual generators themselves, the point that you bring up is really interesting because the problems that a wind farm or a solar farm or a nuclear plant or a traditional combined cycle plant, a natural gas plant or a coal plant, they have totally different production profiles and they have totally different problem sets that they are trying to optimize for. You can think about the ease with which you can ramp a particular load, and those would be dispatchable loads, things like your thermal plants, your peaker plants, your nat gas, your coal plants, your nuclear plants. But it's a lot easier to turn the dial on a natural gas plant and kick out more energy than it is to do that on a nuclear plant, and it's also substantially higher risk. Coal is another great example because coal is now in this really, really bizarre place where the same way as your engine in your car, assuming that you drive a combustion engine vehicle, your engine is going to have some point, right? Some point where at a certain speed, and it's why they give you, at least in the US, they give you the miles per gallon for highway and the miles per gallon city, right? And assuming it's just an internal combustion engine, that highway is probably going to be higher than the city in terms of your miles per gallon. But there's really some speed, on a flat road, there's some speed. It's 62, it's 65, it's 75, where you hit that point of the curve where the car is as efficient as it can be. And if you're going 90, it's less efficient. If you're going 40, it's less efficient. Steady on a single road, right? Large thermal plants, particularly large coal plants in this example, are the exact same way, but they're under this very bizarre situation in some parts of the US where they're being asked to ramp up and down. And so they're being asked to fall out precipitously from the most efficient point of their thermal load, their thermal generation. And what that does, incidentally, is that when you start to ask it to perform less efficiently, it's a coal plant. It's going to be terrible. It's going to produce immense amount of excess debris and carbon and things like this. Everything that these regulatory agencies hate. But they're put in a position where they're actually being asked to do the less efficient thing because the grid is needing something different from them because of various other players in the space. So you have a very unique opportunity where, and coal just happens to be a fantastic example. A coal plant is really happy to sit at that point of maximal thermal efficiency and just crank and crank and crank. And it is very unhappy. And all of the various efficiency systems and the various processing systems and injection systems and consumption systems, all of those become very clogged and nasty and dirty and very looked down upon by regulatory regimes and monitoring regimes. The introduction of the Bitcoin miner changes that whole calculus. It says that they can continue to operate at that point of maximal efficiency, but they now, instead of a single buyer through the grid, they can now have this behind the meter buyer, and they can solve the problem that's specific to them as a generator. And so as you look at each generator, you get the same thing for each of them. A combined cycle plant, a nat gas plant, is happy to sit at a point of higher utilization because they may be called to ramp down. And heck, I want to make money. If I have a machine that can make money, I want to run that machine. If the grid doesn't want my electricity, I'm going to sell it to these Bitcoin guys. The coal plant wants to operate at that point of thermal efficiency. When you go into wind and solar, these non-dispatchable loads, you run into a different problem, which is, okay, I have no incremental cost on the additional megawatt that I provide to the grid, right? Where I start to run into problems is my access to the grid, because it turns out in certain places you can put a lot of wind and you can put a lot of solar, and people know this. So what happens? The party starts to get crowded. You start to have everybody there, and the nature of the beast is that there's only really a couple of exits to get in and out of this party. And so when everybody's rushing there because the wind is ramping up and all of your turbines and your wind farm are going, it's not just you on this hill in Wyoming. It's also the guy who's running his own site on the other hill in Wyoming. And so you run into these interconnect issues where actually getting access to the grid is your business problem. It's not actually operating at a point of maximum thermal efficiency,
Mhm.
because your incremental cost, your marginal incremental cost is zero. It's the wind or it's the sun. So what happens is now you have the exact same problem in a different form that can be resolved by consuming your energy behind the meter.
Mm.
And you're monetizing these very different generators for very different purposes, but you're doing it in the same way.
Yeah, that's incredibly fascinating. And it reminds me of conversations I've had with people maybe in the traditional finance sector where myself, or I imagine any Bitcoiner who's read a book or two could probably give them a lesson on the history of money, store of value, all of these concepts that you and I are deeply familiar with. But actually, a lot of people don't ever ask that question, even though that's what they're doing. And they have this very narrow scope, and that's looking at the financial side. But I'm wondering, in terms of the energy side, I mean, where are the thought leaders? Because I think, between you and me, we could probably host a show on energy, given what we've read. Yet I don't see the conversations about energy and this kind of interdisciplinary approach that we're taking here. I think a lot of people kind of are in their lane, and there's something unique about the Bitcoin perspective where it sort of sits outside of a lot of this stuff. And so I can see the different perspectives and synthesize them together. And I wonder, who's talking about energy, maybe not even from a Bitcoin perspective, but in the way we're describing, and where are those conversations at? Because I'm not seeing them.
You know what's so interesting is that when you think about who before say 10 years ago, so Bitcoin exists, but Bitcoin mining is not an industry per se. The people who would be maybe most adamant about energy would be environmentalists, would be activists, would be guys that are, chaining themselves to trees because they're gonna cut down this old growth forest and they're gonna build something, some kind of generation facility. It was a lot of the naysayers. It was the Greenpeace guys. It was people who kind of had this really impassioned kind of raison d'etre. They had uh, this love of the earth, this activist ideology. Okay, so you fast forward and you look at, okay, who have been the biggest advocates in the last 5 years? Because you've had a couple of generations of the traditional environmentalists, right? They have gotten a serious head start, and they have been able to run very far into directing the narrative around energy and directing the policy around energy. And at least in my sort of naive, high level perspective of it, and some of my conversations with folks that have been deeply ingrained in that way of thinking, it became very apparent to me that a lot of these people have never actually been challenged in their way of thinking. That there has been kind of this immense kind of uniform zeitgeist where everybody was on the same page, and maybe they disagreed marginally about what should be happening with nuclear fuel or nuclear reactors because that was scary. But they were all kind of rah-rah on the main cause. They were all kind of rah-rah on, you've got to get rid of the trucks on the road, and you've got to mandate a bunch of particular implementations into vehicles to make them more efficient, and you've got to give a bunch of EV credits or something like this. Everyone has to switch to their electric car. And a lot of these folks have really, in my perspective, not really been seriously challenged on the merits
Mm.
of the argument. And it seems that has only started to really spin up since the book Fossil Future, if you've read that one. Um, what is the guy's name? Alex. It'll
Fossil
come to
future.
me.
Yeah, yeah.
But Fossil Future, it's a fantastic book. The guy's a philosopher, and he wrote this book that essentially says, yes, we can say that there is such a thing as anthropogenic carbon production that has an impact on some sort of macro climate secondary tertiary impact, right? We can agree that that's a thing, right? And it wouldn't in some sense make sense not to, right? We have seen all the stuff that we've produced. We have kind of seen the British turn of the century factories with the smog in the sky, and we've seen the pictures of Chinese cities that have the smog dangling. We know that there is something happening with the way that we are producing energy, and we know that there's an anthropogenic impact, a human-driven impact. What we can then have a conversation about is it existential? So is it going to mean that we wake up one day and the trees have all died and we're going to die in 3 years in a nuclear winter? That's debatable. The other thing that we can disagree on is it worse than the alternative? So what he really gets into is this kind of pro versus anti-human idea, which is that the innovation of humanity is based particularly on the consumption, well, the production and consumption of energy. And so that's a very pro-human stance. So he brings it this kind of pro-human versus decelerationist ideology, this what he calls this kind of anti-human ideology. He was really the person who I think has kind of tipped this off in a way that was really powerful because it was a good faith argument. It was made extremely logically. The guy's a professor by background or philosopher by background. And I think what we have seen come from that is that that book has particularly empowered a lot of folks that now have specific interests in energy. Um, Bitcoin miners being one of them.
Yeah.
You've seen a lot of advocacy from large publicly traded companies to educate folks about what we're doing and about the positive externalities, not just this sort of whitewash, activist washed, very, very negative perspective of what we're doing that really harkens to this book, Fossil Future, which is this idea that no, you actually want more energy production. You can negotiate how efficient it is or the way in which it's done, but electricity itself is not the problem. Human flourishing is contingent on the production and consumption of energy. Let's talk about the margin. Let's talk about the degree of impact without getting into this sort of sensationalizing, without saying, oh, we're going to wake up tomorrow and all the ice caps are going to be melted and Denver's going to be, an island in the middle of the US because all of central US is flooded or something crazy like that.
Yeah. So that's Alex Epstein.
Epstein, there we go. Thank you.
2022 Fossil Future. Well, I think that's very interesting because what that presents, Robert, is as you say, it's sort of the first time that maybe these ideas have been challenged or approached from a different perspective. And certainly the New Zealand story and Japan to an extent as well, there is a narrative and kind of a history of sort of a nature and I guess more so in New Zealand, a sort of a relationship to the land and a kind of certain privilege potentially where, those problems are out of sight and out of mind, especially if you're importing those fuels.
That's right. Yeah.
And I guess what I was getting at with my question, just as the bankers and the traditional finance people simply don't understand the nature of money because they've been living in that ecosystem, it seems like the conversation around energy is almost being led by these Bitcoiners who are maybe come from that world. I know a lot of Bitcoin miners come from oil and gas, or they come from these real world industries and they've seen the light of Bitcoin. And everyone else seems to be operating still in that kind of ZERP kind of VC framework, as I said before. Maybe they think that smart meters in people's houses is going to change the fact that we haven't built generation assets in 40 years. And I think that it's like a different perspective. And I think the connecting thread between those is that the Bitcoiners have sort of gone and we zoom out and we're able to attack the question in a very Socratic way. From many perspectives. And I haven't seen that. I would like to know if anyone does know if there's any purely energy conversations happening out there that maybe aren't affiliated with Bitcoin or they're not interested in Bitcoin. I'd like to see because, what solutions are they coming up with and how do those actually work? Because, the concept of a data center, pumped hydro batteries, all of those things are very interesting, but they don't solve all of the issues. And it seems like there's still space. And I think if anyone was to undertake that work, they would very quickly realize Bitcoin mining is the solution. And just one more thing on that. I've had a number of people come to me and say, I had an energy problem and I learned about Bitcoin and then I became a Bitcoin miner. Is that something you've come across with people you've met?
Yeah, well, here's the thing is like you have to, are you looking at the space as something ideologically interesting, or are you looking at it as a business? Because the only way that I think, personally, the reason that Bitcoin mining is so fascinating to me is because it's the combination of both.
Mm,
It's the combination of something that's ideologically very interesting to me and I align with, and it's also something that is deeply aligned with solving a very, very interesting business problem. The
mm,
best example in the book is when you look into Eric Hersman talking about development in Africa and what had been traditionally funded by large NGOs through the submission process, these really long lead times. You're going to get $10 million. You have to BS some NGO about how this generation is going to save this small village, and all of a sudden they're going to all be, singing karaoke and charging their iPhones in 5 years. It throws all that out the window and very elegantly says, well, now we can actually use traditional financing because we can ensure that the customer is there. And that's
mm,
what that's what's often missing when you have these strong ideological arguments, is that you forget that the technology might be cool, but the business doesn't exist unless you have a customer.
mm,
There's no such thing as a business without a customer. It has
mm,
the revenue has to come from somewhere. And you can build the coolest piece of technology in the universe, but unless there's somebody who wants to buy it, it's just a cool piece of technology. Like it's a hobby. That's what's so interesting to me about Bitcoin mining is that it's the confluence of those things. And I think it's, as you said before, harking to the VC conversations, that people kind of have this allergic reaction to Bitcoin. And that's what I liked about writing and saying, okay, think of the shoebox, is because if you just tease out the Bitcoin thing, you say, forget about the Bitcoin thing for a second, right? It's a box, it makes you money. That's
yeah,
it. I have
yeah,
a box, it makes me money. Cool. What can I do with it?
yeah. It's funny. This guy who said, "Oh, Bitcoin mining is interesting, but I wish it was something with a bit more utility." And we call electrical suppliers in the grid, we call them utilities.
Utilities.
I
Yeah.
think it's all very interesting, this conversation, and certainly with our creative backgrounds, I did photography. I've also done a lot of design work and communication work, and I understand that from an engineering perspective, there's a certain logical mindset that maybe struggles with understanding why people are so anti-nuclear, or they have these kind of beliefs. But the reality is humans are quite illogical and irrational, and they are taken by emotional topics. And one thing that really stands out in New Zealand, there's this campaign, it's called Gen Less, and it's all about saving power, turning off your lights, and these kinds of things,
Oh,
which
wow.
are
Yeah.
very, I mean, it's kind of everywhere, I guess, there's a focus on this, but in particular this is like a campaign. And I think that sort of stands in contrast to what Epstein talks about in Fossil Future, which is this human flourishing framework, and using as much energy as possible to make things happen, because that's the basis of society. That's the base layer. Energy feeds into
That's
everything
right.
from agriculture through to housing to heat, industrial processes. And so trying to use less and trying to like economize, it's sort of like not really the way to the future. It's kind of like becoming a wealthy nation by taxing your citizens higher.
That's right. It doesn't work.
It's not logical, right?
Yeah.
Um,
Energy is no, I think you're so spot on. It's like energy is so important. Energy is so important that we will utilize sources of energy that are substantially better, even when they have worse secondary impacts on us. So, like
mm,
two examples, historical example, modern example. The historical example is the really, really good book on energy called Energy and Civilization by a guy named Vaclav Smil. It starts talking about agriculture, food, and a transition from being largely kind of, foragers to then farming. And the transition into farming, basically, you went from things you would forage from the woods that were various and very biodiverse and nutritionally very diverse, all of a sudden to the introduction to monocropping, particularly wheat. Wheat was the big thing that people were farming. And what happened when you did that, right? When you went from foraging to farming, particularly wheat, you now have a product that is substantially more calorically dense and it is substantially easier to produce. So you are able now to to rocket the amount of energy, calories, the amount of calories that you were able to dump into a society to literally power the humans that need to do things that serve as the baseline of your ability to start this sort of early capitalistic venture, sort of early Adam Smith arguments, right? This idea of differentiation of labor and things like this, because you can just inject these very calorie dense foods into people. But what happens? You get the calories, you get the energy, but you start to lose other things. You start to lose the diversity of your mineral content. You just start to lose diversity in your nutritional value. And so you do something that's actually, it nets out in such a way that you have these secondary effects that are bad to the people who are using them. It's not good just to have bread products day in, day out. It's not good for your body. Your body wants to have nutritionally a more diverse set of foods that are powering it. However, in the macro, just the raw calories, the raw energy density is the defining factor. Now, I thought that was such a brilliant argument that he was making because I had never thought about food, calories in and of themselves, as being something that was pivotal to human flourishing in early social cohesion, early development
Mm,
of towns and society and division of labor. It's
mm,
almost like, and here's the modern example, the price for a calorie today is so insanely cheap that we have an obesity epidemic.
mm.
Calories are so cheap nowadays, and the food is just made from anything. You have this other secondary movement, right? The whole food movement, the carnivore diet guys, the guys that are, getting rid of the microplastics, getting rid of high fructose corn syrup and ultra processed foods, which is good. But we're so addicted to energy at this base level that we are willing to just juice ourselves with, 48-ounce Slurpees that have 2,300 calories in them that cost 99 cents. That if you were a peasant back in, rural Scotland, could have powered you for the better part of 3 days. And when you think about the monetary input that somebody would have to actually produce that amount of caloric density, nowadays it's almost negligible, right? You could
Yeah.
you could buy a Coke and get, 240 calories for 99 cents or something like this, or you can just get free refills at Costco and, drink all your calories for the day for $1.50 and get a hot dog. The
Yeah.
price of calories is negligible, and as a result, we're throwing trash into ourselves. But the defining trend is there, which is that you still push to the energy density. You're always looking for more energy.
Yeah. It's like an energy maximalist approach,
Yeah.
because I mean, there is a history alongside all of that of austerity and people who chose to live in a cloistered life where they fasted and they didn't eat, and it was like, man, that's your body opens itself up for attack from viruses and disease when you don't have enough energy, and that's there's a whole it's a whole dynamic thing, and it's not just the idea of the energy grid. It's like energy, it flows through all matter. It's kind of gets a bit existential, but it's all connected, right?
That's right.
But Robert, one other thing I just wanted to solicit your thoughts on, please, was you talk a lot about this importance of a business model in your book and the different kinds of business models. And there's kind of this current topic right now within Bitcoin mining around the role of mining pools, block templating, and the decentralization of mining. And I just wondered if you had any high-level thoughts on how you look at that, given this perspective we've got. This is quite encompassing, that if there is a captured Bitcoin network, for example, maybe the value of the Bitcoins goes down and everyone loses. It's kind of a tragedy of the commons. So what are your thoughts on stuff like the push towards decentralizing the mining pools and the block templating?
I think decentralization as a general force, I think, is net positive, right? It's something that we want in all aspects. In the network, you want, say, decentralized nodes. You want folks that are running nodes dispersed all over the world so that you don't have a single geographical risk associated with the code, the verification that you're doing of blocks that are coming in. The same thing applies to Bitcoin mining, but surprisingly, I've found a lot of people understand the principles, but don't actually understand the threat vectors, or don't really understand what happens at the ground level and why it's good or bad, or what problem solves, or rather what solution solves what problem, right? So we have had a lot of conversation, and I think it's been very important conversation that has particularly been brought up by the ocean mining crew. And they have really taken the torch from the Stratum V2 community, which preceded it and was working on this. These are folks like Matt Carollo, um, uh, Jan Kapek from Brains, who's also working on this. There's another developer whose name I unfortunately forget at the moment, but first it was Stratum V2. Now it's Ocean with their Datum protocol. And I think a lot of people start to get into, horse racing, right? They want to figure out who's going to finish first and win, but they don't really understand the problem. At core, the problem is if you read the original white paper and you say, okay, in the white paper, where does Satoshi talk about Bitcoin mining? Does he tell us that we're going to have ASICs, and does he tell us that we're going to have all this these mega miners and all this stuff like this? No. In fact, when he refers to a node, he's referring to the node as in the computer. He's thinking in terms of a computer, CPU. So he has no idea of this differentiation of like an ASIC, like a dedicated computer that has the hash boards, that has the chips that do the one thing, the hashing function. He's only thinking in terms of CPUs. Now that doesn't make him dumb. It doesn't mean that he was had no foresight in this aspect of the industry. It just means that because this aspect of the industry was so rooted in the physical world, I don't think he could have even imagined it, right? I don't think in his wildest dreams he could have imagined the current landscape of Bitcoin mining, right? He, she, or they, not to gender Satoshi, right? The grand they. So what's the problem? The problem is in our current situation. Actually, let me go one step back, if I may, right?
Yeah.
What was the problem that was bumping up that brought us to where we are today? The original problem was that we had these things called GPUs, and people were using GPUs to mine Bitcoin. And other people who were running their CPUs went from being able to find maybe a block a day or a couple of blocks a week to now finding a block a month. And this sucks because I want to find a block, especially when there's 50 Bitcoin. Now, at the time, it was hardly worth anything. But if I'm a cypherpunk or a developer, it's a cool thing. I want to find blocks. I want to play the mining game. Why am I letting my computer churn in the corner? And these guys are out there and they're kicking our butts. Merrick on the Bitcoin Talk forum comes out and announces Slush Pool, which essentially now you can blame him for all of our problems, right? What he says is, hey, if we work together, we can all work together and form a giant miner, right? A pool. And that lets us be competitive with the GPU miners. And the problem that we have to solve for if we're going to be a big pool is that, okay, we're a bunch of guys, we're all working. Some of us are working harder, some of us are working less hard. So I have to know how hard everyone is working. I have to be checking up on everyone who's working. And then when you find a block, I have to make sure that you don't just kind of cut bait and run and steal it and disappear. That would be really bad. So you wind up with this central entity, the pool, who is creating your block templates and kind of telling people what to work on and keeping a tracker of who's performing for what percentage of the whole. So if one person is doing 50% of the work in the pool, hey, when we find a block, they should get 50% of the rewards. And so you solve all these interesting technical problems. And from there, you even keep going multiple steps further, which is first, people only get paid out when they find a block. Well, that makes sense. We find a block, we divvy it up, we give it to the people who are contributing. There's this next step, which is, okay, well, people want to be paid all the time. So now more pools develop and they say, hey, we have this new funding scheme. We understand it's kind of a statistics game on how we hit blocks. So we'll keep doing that kind of ranking thing and keep an eye on you and how you're performing and giving you the work. But we'll just pay you continuously because we know over time it'll all kind of average out through the law of large numbers, right? But then you run into a problem. And the problem is that now the miners, who are very kind of estranged from making the blocks themselves, because they're not really running a node per se, they're kind of taking direction and working on it. They now are very happy because they're being paid continuously, which they wouldn't have otherwise been. And they're being paid in proportion to how we're finding blocks, and it's all assayable. So I'm making money. I'm covering my margins. I understand my hash price. It's basically commoditized. But I've created a problem for myself. Is the network. The miner's happy, but I've now created a situation where the most successful pools now are essentially able to control what goes into a block. And so that poses a macro problem, which is decentralization of deciding what goes into a block. And so this is what in a couple of implementations of Stratum v2 they are solving for. This is what the datum protocol is solving for. And they're not there yet, to be frank, because there are still centralizing problems. In the datum protocol, you still need a datum coordinator to be able to coordinate payouts. And so you still have a threat vector. Now, that being said, is it better than having these large single entities kind of as a black box control what goes into the block? Yeah, it's better. Is it perfect? No, but it's an incremental gain. And I think the positive thing is that first off, they raise the conversation and they're starting to educate people on the nature of the problem. The second thing is that they're incrementally improving what happens next. As far as what where we are in a couple of years from now, I don't know, because a lot of Bitcoin miners don't care about pool centralization. So you have to come up with a business reason, not an ideological reason, that is going to compel them to do something that is pro-decentralization. So I kind of think we're still fighting that out, right, as an industry. The options that we have now in terms of decentralizing technology, they're young, they're taking us in the right direction. And I am confident that there are smart people working on the problem. But what is like the core business sense where we can say, yep, I'll switch because it makes dollars and cents sense to me? I'm not 100% sure that we're there. Now, does that mean we won't get there? No, it just means that, maybe it takes 6 months, maybe it takes 2 years. But I think it's down the road.
Interesting. Thank you for sharing that.
Of course.
It's really interesting. The ocean guys actually visited Japan, and we went and saw this mining facility.
I saw your photo with them. Yeah.
Yeah, it was really interesting, and something I've been thinking about. Just how it's sort of perhaps the most centralized aspect of the network. Exchanges have always been a sort of a choke point, but then there's this other emerging choke point, and sort of how that. I think critically looking at that from all sides, because there is a business case to be made for the regular payouts and the stability that gives, and then maybe there's things on the other side of that. You mentioned some of the derivative products and things that can be used to smooth that over.
That's right.
That are being developed. So I'm following this space very closely. I think it maybe comes back to what you were mentioning though, that there's kind of a practical and an ideological compromise or sort of negotiation that has to be made to stay profitable, because if you're not getting paid out regularly enough, probably going to go broke.
That's right.
And maybe we can even think about this, Robert, similar to the way we think about the energy grid, where there's all sorts of different players, because I know the bit axes and these kinds of things have started to really blow up in terms of popularity. And it's quite a small amount of hash rate globally, but it is a bit of a force really when you've got all of these machines that if big miners weren't putting the blocks through that you wanted, there is still some hash rate floating around that's going to put in it's going to take the free market of the mempool. So it's very interesting. I don't have, you're over this more than me, but I find it very interesting, and I look forward to sort of where that goes.
It's going to be exciting. I love the BitX project. A huge fan of Scott, the instigator, and everyone else who's working on it. And I think they have their stated goal. They'll tell you that they want to have, 1 million bit axes, and that will get them to over an exahash. And that's going to be kind of their glorious moment. Having worked with megamines, I've seen multiple exahash in single buildings.
Yeah.
So the math doesn't math to me intuitively, just because seeing these multi-hundred or 100 megawatt buildings and seeing these machines just cranking out exahashes and exahashes, that is performance at scale. What's really most interesting to me when it comes to the BitX project is twofold, right? The first is the aspect of education, because for me, I had to plug an S9 into an apartment socket. It was such a pain in the ass, and it was ripping loud, and it was so hot. And thank God I am now married to my then girlfriend at the time, that she was willing to put up with having some industrial equipment in our second bathroom. but it's an option now that's such a powerful educational tool. It's so insanely powerful because now it's a single chip and I can see this thing that is working, is contributing, is putting in work uh, on the Bitcoin network. But that I actually think is a totally distinct outcome from where I think a lot of the really interesting power is going to be in these projects is that they are so open source that they're going to start to develop what will start as a cottage industry and then I think become kind of a full-scale commercialized industry of creating custom aspects or custom builds of Bitcoin mining machines. And because these people are doing it open source and they're all learning in public and they're so rip and smart in what they're doing, the kinds of creative stuff that's coming out of it that it will eventually be commercialized, I think is going to really be the part that is most influential to the industry, not just the education thing. I think that's very, very powerful. But I think in terms of the space itself, the kinds of deployments that they're going to make with these totally open source boards, the way that they're using the chips, the way that they have the for everything is going to blow the doors off of what's been happening in the ASIC production world when you look at the Bitmains and the WhatsMiners of the world who have kind of been fighting their customers for the last, 8 to 10 years because they don't really like secondary firmware. They don't like people coming in and
Oh,
running
yeah.
brains on their S19. They're always coming up with ways to keep you out. And all of a sudden, these guys are coming out of nowhere with these single chip deployments and eventually are going to be making full machines that are going to be 100% open sourced. And you're just going to have this influx of people who are going to be building absolutely wild deployments, which I'm totally sure of over the next even 2 to 4 years. We're going to see some really, really immense stuff coming out of that space that is
Yeah.
going to start to blow the doors off of the whole commercialized industry because all of a sudden it's going to be very, very open source.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. And in regards to the BitX, I'm a big fan. And what I love about it as an educational tool, as you say, because yeah, my first experience was an S9 as well, and it was quite exciting, plugging it in and
Yeah.
giving it a go. But what I'm really excited about, and I didn't get a chance to do this last night, but if I was there and I had a BitX and I had it hooked up to a small USB battery pack, and the guy said, "Oh, I think it's a waste of time," and I could pull that out of my pocket and say, "Well, look, I'm mining Bitcoin right now." I mean, there's something about that. It's so accessible, and you can do workshops. You can go into schools and do stuff,
That's right.
and it's sort of, the next generation of engineers. Where are they going to come from? It's the kids, right? And so, doing workshops, maybe small solar panels, after school programs. There's all sorts of stuff you can do that's very, very exciting, and maybe in a kind of idealistic sense, maybe it brings back that builder attitude that we've seemed to have lost maybe over recent decades. I think there's still interest, but there's something about seeing it and being able to build with it and kind of, especially with the bit X, it's kind of like almost like Legos. You can kind of
Yeah.
build
It's hands-on, right? It's
hands-on. You can build cases for them, these kinds of things. And then yeah, your point about the incumbent Chinese ASIC manufacturers who, I mean, I was in Hong Kong for Bitcoin Asia a couple of months ago, and certainly my my impression and the truth we know, I mean, they don't really care about Bitcoin. I mean, that's something they put up with, but they don't really like us doing custom firmware. And in the case of Bitmain, I mean, they've historically been outright aggressive towards Bitcoin.
yeah.
And trying to cause issues there. So I really would encourage and look forward to a future where we have a diversity of manufacturers, especially different countries, different regions of the world making these things,
Huge.
so that we don't have a supply chain bottleneck. But all of that said, Robert, really interesting conversation. Thank you for sharing your insight on this, and yeah, sharing your book, the Bitcoin Miners Almanac, which I highly recommend people check out. If you want to share maybe a little bit like what's on your roadmap, like what are you working on at the moment, and what's like kind of what's coming up for you next, Robert?
Oh, sure. Good question. And thank you for having me. It's been such a pleasure. I'm
No,
glad
no,
that we could connect, Cody. And I love seeing all the stuff that you've been producing. And I can't wait to see how you progress over over the coming months and years. There's always a shortage of thoughtful educators when you start to get into a bull run. So it's good to know who's there and has
thank
been
you.
producing stuff for a little bit.
Yeah,
Yeah, in terms of the future, what's been really interesting for me to see with the book, and I'm sure you've had this experience as somebody who's a creator as well, is that, now I'm going through and doing the audiobook, so reading through, and this is really a good opportunity to fix little edits, things that I've missed, continue to get feedback. And then, of course, there are things that just outright need to be kind of added or modified, particularly around, the addition of two-phase cooling. And there's some other stuff that, frankly, I think I can just explain certain things better. Hashing is one of the hardest things to explain. And I had the opportunity a couple of weeks ago to give a presentation at our local Denver Bit Devs on hashing in particular, and finally feel like I'm at a point where the flow makes sense and it's coherent. And I think it started in the book and it's good, but it's not good enough for me to kind of give it to a layperson. Can I give it to my mom? Can I give it to my wife who is sort of like, yeah, that's nice, honey. I kind of gloss through that part and have her be confident that she actually kind of gets it. She's got the mental pictures. Where I'm going is I'm thinking about the second edition of the book is actually one thing that I want to sneak in between the first section and the second section. And I kind of started on it in the book, but didn't really fully flesh it out. But I have essentially a framework for it. And I kind of get into, once we go over through kind of the what and the how. So what is the machine and how do you run it, the various ways that you might do that. And we start to look into kind of the business model, the money side. What occurs to me is that there actually needs to be more conversation there. And where my head is that currently there are really kind of three ways that you mine Bitcoin, right? And I'm sure as soon as the second edition goes to print, there will be a fourth way that necessitates the creation of a third version. But I guess that's kind of the nature of the beast in choosing
Yeah.
to write a book on this industry at this time, right? I think there's really three ways that you mine Bitcoin. You mine Bitcoin ideologically, which is to say you want to procure no KYC sats. You want to run a BitX and support the network. You want to tinker, but you fundamentally don't care about the business, right? You maybe have a limit, a threshold where it's like, okay, I don't want to spend $600 a month on electricity, but to a certain extent, you don't care. You're getting the sats, you're tinkering, you're having fun, you're doing something small, right? The next step is a business. And a business is either you're providing some kind of value, right? You're a pure play Bitcoin miner, or you are a large grid operator, or you're an oil and gas Bitcoin miner, or even a utility Bitcoin miner. You mine for heat, which is a new thing that's really spinning up. There's a guy, Tyler Stevens, who published something called the Heat Punks Manifesto, where he's a thermal engineer, very interested in how Bitcoin mining is this ancillary heating source on, thermal necessities in the modern world. That's kind of that all fits under mining as a business, which I go into in great depth, obviously in the second part. To some extent, the ideological part, with the Econo Alchemist interview, but I want to add a little more frame to it. And the third way that you can mine Bitcoin is as a state actor. And that might be Bhutan, that is using their resources to quietly mine Bitcoin. That might be El Salvador, that is mining Bitcoin, their volcano energy, right? And they're monetizing all of these renewables, these big wind farms, solar farms that they have deep inland in El Salvador. And you have Russia, who may or may not be mining Bitcoin, but probably is mining Bitcoin. Is always sort of hinting or winking or alluding to something or mentioning something about digital currencies, but we're never quite sure, and we probably won't ever be. Uh, but there's a third way, and it's distinct because it's not necessarily ideological. It's not necessarily done purely as a business. It's done as a state actor who has, at least in recent history, taken the responsibility of minting and distributing our capital, the money that we use. What happens when they start to use Bitcoin as a state force? They start to use state resources, state energy, and start to mine Bitcoin with it. Those are kind of the three domains that I'd like to explore and map out before we get into the actual voices of the individuals doing it. And I think we can add a couple of voices. I think we can add Scott to the conversation. I've already asked him. He said he'd be interested in being an interview. But I also want to talk to these guys that are state mining because they have something interesting to say. And it's not a conversation that I think is being had. We all see
Mm.
Samson Mao running across the world advocating for Bitcoin broadly. but we don't necessarily hear the voices of a state that kind of gets it and is mining Bitcoin. And I want to know what that perspective is because it's very distinct from a person who's an ideological miner and very distinct from somebody who's a business miner.
Yeah.
So that's where my head is at going forwards. And that's kind of how I'm thinking about, okay, if I can just get this brushstroke on, then it will be done. But I also recognize that this is probably not going to be done.
Yeah, that just one comment on that, Robert. So that's really fascinating. I think if you look at the history of infrastructure development in the US, something like the Hoover Dam, and the same could be said about New Zealand, but a lot of these major infrastructure projects were state sponsored, and there's a free market libertarian argument about whether that was good or not. But certainly, I mean, they were able to just make it happen, and I think that is a bit of a force to be reckoned with because you can just do it, and it's kind of not, it's not ideological like the BitX miner, but it's like money is no object, at least in the short term, because they can just they can print the money and build the thing. So what does that mean? That's a very interesting thing. I could see that actually blowing up into a very large section to write about. So yeah, good luck with that. I mean, I look forward to reading that. But that could be maybe the next era that we look at. You know, Bhutan's just come out about their mining holdings. And as you say, many countries are using this as a vehicle for getting Bitcoin. So how that relates in terms of the energy side as well, could be really fascinating.
Huge. Yeah.
So, Robert, that's really cool. I really appreciate you sharing what you're doing there. If people want to follow you, they want to get a hold of your book, where can they go?
Sure. So easiest place to find me on Twitter, Bikes and Bitcoin. You'll see a picture of me with laser beams coming out of my face, and that's how you'll know it's me. If you'd like to get a copy of the book, you can get it. It's published through Bitcoin Magazine Publishing. So you can go to their website and get it. You can also get it on Amazon. You can get the ebook version on Amazon. And if you want to just kind of see some more high-level information about it, we now have a website. So bitcoinminersalmanac.com will give you all of this sort of juicy, high-level, boilerplate, fancy overview stuff that you could possibly enjoy in one sitting. So yeah, those are the easiest ways to get a hold of me. And yeah, I really appreciate you having me to talk through all these things.
Yeah, cool. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Thank you for listening. I do hope you enjoyed the show. I am Cody Allingham, and that was the transformation of value. If you would like to get in touch, please send me an email at hello@thetransformationofvalue.com, and I will get back to you.